Photoshop, there are several ways of actually resizing images and rotating images in order to get your actual desired outcome. Now, you've probably already looked at image size because there's a video in this submodule actually talking about image size. And you also have image rotation here, which allows you to essentially rotate your entire image to either 180 degrees, 90 degrees clockwise, counterclockwise, and also allowing you to actually set arbitrary values as well, or arbitrary values in degrees. You can also choose to flip your canvas horizontally and vertically. So there are your two main options. But one specific one that I actually prefer to use on a lot of occasions is actually transforming your images. Now, the difference primarily between, say, coming in here and actually rotating your image as opposed to transforming your image is that rotating your image through image rotation will actually rotate your entire canvas, which in some cases you may not want because you may have multiple layers and you may only want to rotate one specific layer. So in order to actually do that, what we need to do is essentially first create a layer so I can actually demonstrate the process. So I'm going to actually duplicate this background layer here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to select the background layer, and then I'm actually going to go across to the paint bucket tool, which you can select by pressing G on your keyboard as the shortcut. And then I want to actually make sure that I have white selected as my foreground color, which I already do. So then I'm going to click on the image. And once it's finished processing, you'll notice now that I have a white background. And that's primarily just to sort of be able to easily show you what I'm actually doing with my transformations. So next, I'm going to select the background copy, and we'll actually go to Edit. Now, what you'll notice is we have two options for transform. We have free transform and transform. And you'll notice with transform, you've got a drop-down menu and you have quite a few different options available to you. So let's take a look at free transform first. So with free transform, as I mentioned before, it's going to apply it specifically to the layer that you're currently on, as opposed to the entire image or file that you're working on. So if I just click on that, now you'll notice here we've got these little outside borders around the image. And they essentially allow me to actually change the size. So if I hold down Shift on my keyboard, I can change the size and still keep the actual ratio format of the image the same. Now, if I don't hold down Shift on the keyboard, I can actually change that and distort the image, which in most cases you're not going to really want because it does really make the image look a little bit strange if you do distort it. Now, along with actually resizing the image, you can actually choose to rotate your image. And if you'll notice up the top here, you've got some options in the options bar that'll actually allow you to put in a specific degrees value. And it'll also allow you to actually put in specific sizes for the width and height that you're actually working with. Now, if you did want to actually constrain the proportions of your image, what you could do is just click on the little link icon here, and then that would actually keep all the adjustments that you make to the sizing. So for example, here I'm going to make a, say, 60% reduction in size, then it'll actually apply 60% to the height as well as the width. So that'll keep things in proportion quite nicely, as opposed to if you turn it off, then obviously I could apply 70% or 80%, and that's actually starting to distort the image. So that's essentially what free transform allows you to do. It is extremely useful when you're working, especially with mosaics and multiple images, and you want to move them around on page and essentially just create mosaics. So along with actually using free transform, you can use the actual transform menu that's here as well, and each one of these options will actually do something different. So we have, let's start from the bottom and actually work our way up. So we could flip this layer vertically as opposed to flipping the entire image. It's only just flipped this layer. You can actually go in and choose to actually flip it horizontally. If you have an image that doesn't quite look right, you can go and actually do that as well. And I'm finding this a little bit distracting looking at it upside down, so I'm going to flip it back vertically. So you can play around with having the image back to front if you want. In some cases that can be actually very helpful if the image doesn't quite flow right, with regards to how it's currently laid out. Now, along with that, We also have a couple of other options for actual rotations, and once again, that's just going to rotate that specific layer. Along with rotations, I'll just change that back to the way it was. Along with rotations, we also have scale, rotate, skew, distort, perspective, and warp. Now, a couple of good ones here that you'll really want to play with are, for example, perspective. So this will allow you to actually adjust the perspective of your image, which actually can be very useful, especially if you're, say, shooting architecture, for example, and you want your buildings to be nice, parallel and vertical. And if you've shot them with, say, a wide-angle lens, then you have a sort of, a shift in perspective. So what you can do is you can adjust your images in order to get certain elements to sort of be parallel with the horizon and other buildings and things like that. So from that point of view, the perspective adjustment can actually be quite useful for adjusting your images. Now, along with perspective, we also have distort. Now, this allows you primarily to distort the entire image however you like, essentially, just by dragging on each one of these little anchor points that are displayed once you actually select it. And that's actually can be quite useful when you need to get specific sizings for certain elements that you, say, for example, you select and then you cut out of an image and you just want to adjust them so then they look right with whatever you're combining them with. So distort can be very useful as well. Another one that you'll find quite useful if you go back to transform is actually the warp transform. And this actually is similar to distort, except for it actually gives you more control because you've got more points along each of these axes. So I can go here and actually drag one of these in, and I'll actually start to warp the image in different areas. So you can end up with some very interesting curves and also shapes just from using warp as opposed to distort, which sort of keeps obviously all the edges of the image straight, whereas warp will actually sort of warp them into curves. And that can be really cool for creating some very interesting effects that I actually quite like. And you can also, pull around on the center of the image and you can end up with some very distorted things. So along with warp, you have a couple of other options here as well, such as scale, rotate, and skew. But those distort, perspective, and warp, sort of the primary three that I like to use. Scale is quite, obvious. You just want to actually scale the image. So instead of free transform, you could use scale, but it does very much the same job. You've also got rotate, which essentially is what we've already looked at, how to rotate the image. And then you also have skew as well. So, and skew essentially allows you just to sort of adjust the image based on either of the actual outside edges that the image are currently aligned with. So skew can also be interesting to play around with, but personally I tend to like the perspective, distort, and warp as the free transform or transformation effects adjustments that are actually in Photoshop. So I think you'll find some of them quite useful, especially when you do have multiple layers, as opposed to just going in and adjusting the image size or rotating the entire canvas, which sometimes you just don't want.